Hello and welcome, it's Dr. Fred Frizzle here today, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about nature and its environment. Okay, so nature and its environment. Okay, so first of all, there's a few key terms that I need you to know. So one of those is environment. You've probably heard a lot of people say the word environment, but do you actually know what it means when you refer to an animal's environment? Do you actually know the actual definition of what an environment is? An environment is just essentially a place with particular conditions. So a place with, let's say, specific conditions, because conditions can be different from one place to another. They're not all the same. They don't have to be exactly the same conditions. For example, you could have the Arctic and you could have the desert that are complete opposites. And the animals that live within these extremes, so I'm going to say extreme conditions, survivors. These are known as extremophiles, these animals that live extreme philes. These are animals that actually live in this extreme environment, so like the desert and the Arctic. So in the Arctic, you can have animals such as the snowshoe hare, and you can have animals such as the polar bear. Like both of these animals, to survive in this extreme environment, you might not think it, but they have an awful lot of adaptations that enable them to survive where they do, which basically means they've got a certain amount of characteristics that mean that they can survive. So the polar bear, for example, has thick fur, and it also has a layer of thick fat. And this layer of thick fat isn't just because he's been eating a lot of pies just for the sake of it. It's because the polar bear's built up this layer of fat, and he's naturally inherited it from the genetic information from his parents. So from evolution over time, the polar bears that have got a lot of this thick layer of fat and thick fur are the ones that have survived to pass on their genetic information or characteristics onto their offspring. So this process known as natural selection selects the fittest animals with the best adaptations to enable them to carry on to reproduce, to pass those particular characteristics onto their offspring. So the polar bear has thick fur and a thick layer of fat, and this is to keep warm. They're also white. The reason why they're white is that they're camouflaged so that the prey can't see them. And you're probably thinking, well, prey, well, surely it doesn't matter if the prey sees it, what is the prey going to do to a polar bear? And that's not the point. The point is that they're white and they need to be camouflaged from their prey so that they can actually sneak up on their prey and actually catch it, because they need to have a certain amount of food because it's so cold in the Arctic. The animal actually uses a lot of energy to actually keep itself warm. The other animal that I want to talk to you about a bit is this snowshoe hare. Sorry, I've written shoe hare, it's the snowshoe hare. And the snowshoe hare, in winter, it's white, but it changes colour to brown in the summer. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with what actually happens in the Arctic, like between seasons, but I'll tell you anyway. What happens in the summer is because all the Arctic ice is melting, there's less sort of white snow and ice around, so the environment changes like to a normal environment, which is like just like has some dirt and some grass and stuff. So this is why the snowshoe hare changes colour, so that it's still camouflaged throughout the year. So it's quite clever. I don't know if you've heard of chameleons, but they're lizards that can change to whatever surface they're on. So supposing they're on a blue leaf or something, they can change colour to blue. It's quite incredible. Snowshoe hares aren't quite that sophisticated, but they have adapted to blend into their environment in the particular seasons. Right, the other term, so I've discussed the environment, is the habitat. So I've actually mentioned a habitat here. The Arctic is a specific habitat. A habitat is just somewhere where animals live, in particular, and then the actual complete amount of one species. So the complete number of snowshoe hares, for example, is called a population. You're probably thinking, well, supposing there's a population of snowshoe hares, what do we call snowshoe hare population when it's combined with a polar bear population and any other population that lives in a particular place such as the Arctic. Well, we call this a community. So a community is more than one population together. And when a community, which is all the populations of individual species, such as the polar bear and the snowshoe hare, are combined, when that's combined with its habitat as well, which is where it lives, habitat is where it lives, when the community and habitat combine collectively, this is known as an ecosystem. Okay? So this whole idea of where an animal lives. An animal might live in the environment of the forest. Notice how I've said environment is just a specific set of conditions. So it's like one environment could be forest, another one could be Arctic. Again, they're different environments, but they're also different habitats. So they're also where animals live. So I'll discuss with you a little bit about ecosystems now. The other thing you need to know is you need to know about this whole idea of like pollution and stuff. So supposing we have air pollution, what is this going to affect? Well, it's going to affect temperature for a start. And you might think, well, supposing we have a lot of carbon dioxide in the air, why is that going to warm us up? Because carbon dioxide gas isn't particularly warm. And the answer to that is no, carbon dioxide gas isn't particularly warm at all. But the reason why it warms us up is because carbon dioxide acts as a greenhouse gas, which means it stops heat escaping from the Earth's atmosphere. So it's trapped inside our atmosphere, if you like, which is like a bubble that surrounds the Earth. So essentially, the carbon dioxide leads to the temperature increasing, which then means that certain animals can't function properly. Because animals are adapted for their environment, so I've listed a few adaptations of the polar bear here. Because these animals have specific adaptations for their specific environment, they can't actually cope with quick change, because these adaptations have taken millions of years to come about of natural selection, like selection of the fittest. This whole process takes millions of years, and supposing temperature rapidly increases, the whole organism population isn't going to suddenly change overnight. It's going to take a large number of thousands of years to actually adapt to these particular changes. So this whole idea of temperature means that animals can't survive in their environment. So the process of extinction may be imminent, which means it may be sort of destined to happen. So like for the dinosaurs, we don't actually know what made the dinosaurs extinct, but supposing there was the whole environment for some reason got hugely hotter, supposing there was a load of forest fires or something that pumped a load of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I'm only guessing, by the way, I don't have a clue what wiped out the dinosaurs, but supposing it was the high concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that increased the temperature, then what could have happened is that increase of temperature could have led to the dinosaurs being extinct. Right, so this whole idea of adaptation is very specific, and there's different types of pollution. So there's air pollution that affects temperature, and then you can also have water pollution, which is where various chemicals like oil and stuff can get in the water. So if there's high levels of water pollution, certain animals, we can actually study our environment to find out to find out how bad the water pollution is just by the population that's living there. So for example, freshwater shrimps, freshwater shrimps are very sensitive to their pH, which means the acidity level of the water. Supposing it has some sort of chemical in it that makes it more acidic, then these freshwater shrimps, the whole population of them, as we discussed before, population, will become extinct in that particular area. That doesn't mean it's going to become extinct throughout the whole world, because that just won't happen. Because it's not going to, when we have some pollution in water, supposing somebody spills some oil in a bit of water, that's not going to affect our whole water system throughout the world, because 75% of the world is water, so it's obviously not going to affect all of it. But the point is that our high concentration in one area is going to wipe out the freshwater shrimps in that area. Whereas there's other species like the sludge worm that we can look at, the sludge worm population that live in the same place as these freshwater shrimps, but the sludge worm aren't as sensitive to this water pollution, so supposing the acidity levels increase, the freshwater shrimps would die, so we'd know the pH might be 6. Now I'll draw you out a pH scale so you know what I'm talking about. It's like 0 to 14. Anywhere from 1 to 7 is acidic, 7 is neutral, and 7 to 14 equals alkali. Right, so basically, supposing the optimum pH for a freshwater shrimp to survive was 6, if the pH was lower than 6, then that freshwater shrimp would become wiped out. So we can use this pH scale and use the amount of species that are there and what species are there to like gauge what the pH level of the water actually is without even needing to measure it. What we need to do is observe what species can survive it, and we automatically know if it's going to be a particular pH. The sludge worm, for example, as I said before, is less sensitive, which means it could die out at a pH of 5, for example. So if the pH was 6, then the freshwater shrimp might have died, but there might be still sludge worms around. Supposing the pH of the water was 4, you wouldn't find any sludge worms or shrimps. So this whole thing about pollution, we have to be very careful with what ecosystems we contaminate, because when you have like food chains, as I said before, so like predators and prey, supposing the predators got wiped out by some sort of chemical or something, supposing they got wiped out, then the prey would like multiply a lot. So the prey would multiply in numbers, so you end up with loads of prey. But supposing the prey got wiped out, that would also wipe out the predators as well. And the fact that this prey is multiplying isn't necessarily that good, because the prey, if you remember, can eat some plants and stuff, and those plants might end up becoming wiped out because there's so many prey, because there's not enough predators to eat all the prey, because they've been wiped out by some sort of foreign chemical and stuff. So I've introduced you to the idea of extremophiles and the idea of this, how we can affect our environment. I'd just like to give you a little bit more idea about competition. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned this in this video yet, I don't think I have, but competition, the idea of that is animals and plants have to compete for their environment. So the animals and plants with the best adaptations will be able to survive. So supposing this, we'll use our same example of the stream that's contaminated with this oil, or whatever other acidic chemical is actually in the stream. Supposing like the pH was 6, then we know that the freshwater shrimp would start to become wiped out, but the sludge worm would survive. So the sludge worm would have won essentially the competition, and it would end up multiplying. So this whole idea of competing for water, whole idea of competing for space, and competing for food, because organisms need to eat. Everything that an organism needs to survive, so the pH, as we discussed here, the amount of water, the amount of food, the amount of space, animals are competing, and plants, for space and water. We can find examples of this in forests. For example, you find really big trees and you find really little ones. The really little ones obviously aren't getting enough water, food and space that they actually need to enable them to actually grow into the bigger ones. And that's probably because the bigger ones are blocking out the light, for example, and the smaller ones also need the light to grow. So the smaller ones are obviously going to stay smaller. So that's sort of how this idea of competition actually sort of manifests itself, or actually acts upon what it should be doing. The other thing I'd like to mention is the whole idea of adaptation. So I've already given you the example of the snowshoe hare and polar bear. I'm aware of this, but the other extreme is the cacti and camels that live in the desert. So how is cacti adapted? Well, cacti has a low surface area, which basically means that there's less transpiration. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term transpiration, but all transpiration is it's the evaporation from plants' leaves. So if we look at cacti, they don't really have leaves as such. They have spines, which means that there's less water evaporation, which means cacti doesn't lose that much water, and also cacti are adapted because they store the water in their stems, which means that they have plenty of water for when it's dry for months or years on end. Because in the desert sometimes you might get 5 years without any rain at all. You might get one quick shower and it might all dry up really quickly again, and they might not get another rainfall for another 2 years or so. The cacti needs to be able to soak up all this water and be able to store it in its stem, like to keep it going for the next couple of years before there's another sort of outbreak of rain, outburst of rain. The camels have thick fur on their back, which sort of aids the whole idea of shading. So supposing Supposing there's a really hairy camel and a not very hairy camel. The not very hairy camel will suffer from the effects of getting too hot and get a burnt back, whereas the camel that's sort of got loads of fur on its back, even though the sun's really hot, it still wouldn't be able to penetrate through that hair as much, and the camel would be able to keep cooler. So it's this whole idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest again. The other thing camels have is, and I forgot to mention this with polar bears, there's another adaptation that they have, which is large feet. The reason why they have large feet is to distribute their weight evenly, because obviously polar bears are walking on ice. They don't want the ice to break, so they've got to make sure that their weight is dispersed evenly throughout their foot. So if they have a larger foot, the weight is dispersed over a larger area, which means there's less pressure on a particular point. And the same goes for camels, really, because they're walking on sand. They don't want their feet to suddenly sink miles into the sand, because that would just mean that they can't get around as efficiently. And obviously they're going to die out, because this idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest. So you've got to make sure that you have the right adaptations, and that's some of the adaptations. The other thing about polar bears, they also have thick. Now I've mentioned thick fur, they actually have greasy fur as well, and the greasy fur means that they can swim in water without it affecting their coat too much. So I hope this video has been helpful, and I think that's pretty much everything that I needed to talk to you about. I hope it's been helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.